fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
What's up, Salt Strong Nation? Joe Simons, like diamonds. We are back again. Got my boy Justin, got my boy Wyatt, and we're talking about live bait, the best types of live bait, and where to find them. And this is going to be helpful regardless if you're a live bait angler or even an artificial lure angler, because still, if you know where the best bait is and when it's running, and if you know the fish are feeding on it, you can match the hatch. So this is going to be beneficial for anyone who loves catching redfish and speckled trout, snook, flounder, et cetera. And this is really these baits, live baits that we're talking about today, are going to be the ones that we find from Texas to Florida up to North Carolina, Virginia, and obviously all those other states in between. And we'll be talking about everything from, we'll include shrimp in here, and obviously mullet and pogies and pilchers and sardines and mud minnows and all kinds of cool stuff. So who wants to start this thing off? And because if you're listening, we're here in our homes in the middle of, I guess, apparently another COVID breakout. And so we're not on the water this week doing these podcasts. And so we're going to have to use lures that look like some of these live baits, at least to give you a better idea of what they look like. Because there is some confusion. Some of these little small, baits kind of look similar, both above and below the water. So who wants to kick it off?
I will hop in there.
TikTok. Okay, there we go.
I'm on it. So really excited to talk about this because, there is a time and place to use bait. Even if you don't use bait, I think the biggest part of this podcast, like you said, Joe, is to better understand what bait is in your area, what time of the year is it going to be there, and what's feeding on it. Because if you understand that, that's a key element to better present your offering. Whether you're going to use the same live bait and you're going to get a cast net or sabiki or a high-low double dropper rig to catch croakers, or you're going to use a bunch of different artificial lures to best mimic that bait, the first thing you need to keep in mind is what bait is in your area. And we see that question roll through a lot. Before I got a kayak, I was land-based. I did Sebastian Inlet. I did, Nassau Sound up in Jacksonville. I fished Navarre Pier out in the Panhandle, a bunch of different places. And yes, to maximize my efforts, there were times that having bait, like fresh live bait, was key to getting a bite. And then there were some times, like in Sanibel Pier down in Southwest Florida, when I couldn't buy a bite on live bait and I was using certain artificials and getting reaction responses from fish where artificials outperformed. So it really varies. But the biggest thing that I had to keep in mind is what were these fish feeding on? Because that's what I need to be presenting to them. So I think I kind of just want to lead into it and talk about, like, we had off the call just a quick powwow of all the different types of baits. Inshore, the ones that people are most familiar with, obviously, is shrimp. Okay, shrimp is everywhere, from Texas all the way up through, I think, even just shy of Virginia. Shrimp's probably the most prominent and abundant bait fish out there, and a bunch of different types of shrimp. There's white shrimp, pink shrimp, brown shrimp, shrimp cocktail, shrimp on the Barbie, all kinds of different shrimp. But that's a number one given anywhere in inshore waters or even right off the beach. Shrimp is one of the most, everything eats shrimp. So when in doubt, that's why you'll see in, marinas and piers and jetties and little local bait shops, live, dead, frozen shrimp is like the go-to because everything eats it. So that's kind of like, I think, the default that people will look to if they want to just catch something. Shrimp is probably the main course, and that's probably the most abundant bait fish. You guys agree?
I do.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. After that, mullet. So I think mullet are very abundant. Wyatt, you've talked about following the mullet schools over in Texas right now. We've got the mullet run coming up on the Atlantic coast of Florida from, Georgia line down all the way through Miami. We get herds of giant mullet that'll start making their way out onto the beaches.
Are they called herds? Is that
herds of mullet? Got them herds, schools of mullet. I don't know. Maybe, a school of mullet to me is like a pod, but during the mullet run, it's like miles. So I think it's a herd. I think it's a stampede of mullet.
Ooh,
That's
I like that.
technical term. But for mullet, I mean, even within mullet, there's two different types, guys. You've got striped mullet and you've got silver mullet. This one's got a little bit of a black back, but the silver mullet don't have any stripes to them. And both can be found both on the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast. But I think different times of the year, and there's some that are more prevalent than others. During the mullet run, generally speaking, I see smaller populations of smaller silver mullet on the beach. And then the really, really big ones are those big striped mullet, the really, hog legs, like 12, 15-inch, 4 or 5 pound mullet, like massive mullet, make their way out onto the beach in the next month or two. But mullets, redfish, big trout, snook on both, Atlantic and Gulf Coast. Key in on mullet, they're really, I guess, a high protein diet, pretty fatty. They're a much bigger bait fish. They have, sizes from fresh hatched, 2-3 inches all the way up to, like I said, monster mullet that the big tarpon and snook will feed on the Atlantic coast. But aside from shrimp and mullet being the two most popular, from there, I think it changes. And it really depends on whether the area that you're in has seagrass or oysters or muddy bottom. Because we found out mud minnows, right? And Wyatt, I want you to chime in on this one because mud minnows are probably a pretty common or popular bait fish along the Carolina coast and Jacksonville, northeast part of Florida. But there's certain areas where mud minnows aren't as common. I don't see them as often in Southwest Florida, for example, like areas where it's super, super crystal clear. There's a lot of grass and open grass flats. It's not as common of a bait fish, but where do you tend to find it? Where do you think mud minnows are more prevalent, or where would you normally find them?
So mud minnows, you see them a lot in the coastal marsh type of environments. I don't generally see them on grass flats. I don't see them in open bay systems. It's more in those areas where you got lots of spartina grass. You've got those really winding creeks where it's very tidal focused. I don't know exactly why that environment is conducive for mud minnows, but it seems like from like Jacksonville, Florida, up through, probably all the way up to Virginia, mud minnows are such a heavily used. I know even in Maryland, I used them when I was a kid fishing off docks. Mud minnows are a really, really good bait for the East Coast marsh environments. I do see them used in Louisiana as well. Apparently, they're a pretty good bait up that way. But again, that's another marsh environment. So it seems that the areas where there's big tidal flats, they're mud mostly. There's not sand and grass. It seems like mud minnows are going to be thriving in those environments, and that just becomes a primary forage for redfish, trout, flounder, all those species that we're after.
Cool. What next? And we're not doing these in order, or are we, in terms of what you think is the best?
I don't know if you can necessarily say that there is a best live bait. It's going to change throughout the year. It's going to change with what the fish are dialed in on. I would say that Justin probably ranked them in terms of what's going to work most. Shrimp and mullet shrimp is definitely number one. We've seen this, Texas Parks and Wildlife just did a study on what's the most commonly used live bait with success. It's shrimp. And I know that FWC's probably got a similar study out there. So if we can say that there's one best for numbers, shrimp by far. Now that can change when you're looking at the quality of fish that you're catching. You might not catch as many, but you might get bigger ones. Mullet obviously is good as well. But I think to Justin's point, it's going to then change based on where you live regionally, what's available to you, then what hatches, different seasons, things like that. But really the two main categories, are your bait fishes and your crustaceans. And I would say most of the year, the primary bait to get onto a lot of big fish is going to be a bait fish. Now that can change in the winter time when you start to see less bait fish present. And we'll talk about, those different presentations, but I would say most of what we're going to talk about today is bait fish. And outside of mullet, you've got tons of different names for all the stuff we're going to talk about. Croakers, pogies, menhaden, the same thing. And then, as you go into Florida, you got the threadfin and pilchards that are some available some places, others not. I mean, it really just changes regionally. That's where you leave the shrimp and the mullet, then you start getting into regional specific stuff like the mud minnows.
Don't forget the pinfish too. Yeah, because Peter Deeks did that course with us, live bait mastery. This was before he did the underwater bait forensics. And, he gets real on that first core of both courses, but the first one about here's what I would use to catch like state record or world record, which he's got like 8 world records now off his boat. And for him, like croaker is kind of like one of those but they're tough to find, right? And they get really expensive if you have to buy them. And a lot of times you do because they're tough to catch in quantities. And I remember one time he had some left over. We were fishing in Jupiter Inlet, caught some monster snook using croakers. And there's some other captains there and like, man, yeah, I'll pay $9 a croaker. 9. That gets really expensive when you buy a dozen, like real fast. But there's certain areas, when you have a certain type of like a monster bull red or a monster, like we're talking 44-inch snook. They're smart and they'll sit there and ignore everything. And it's like something about the croaker. I don't know if it's the sound or what, but they just cannot resist it. So it's really intriguing, these different types of baits for different scenarios.
You said it, man. Like you were just going for the jugular right off the bat and said, well, what's the best? And like, Wyatt's right. It is regional, but that's the $1 million question, right? Is when you go somewhere, wherever you're fishing from a pier, off the beach or the local dock, you want to know what's the secret, what's the bait. And like I've asked myself many a times and throughout the year, like for Sebastian Inlet, Brevard County, croakers are money. And croakers have different vernacular based on where you're located. Some people call them spots, right? Like I think even parts of north of North Carolina, they call them spots, and they're not as popular of a bait fish because they can get really big. You can get Virginia croaker or kingfish, and they get so big that as a live bait offering, they're not as awesome. Maybe cut bait for a big redfish that could still work. But yeah, like that's the secret everybody wants to know is for your area specifically, what is the secret bait fish? What is the best one to have and use? And it's hard to answer indefinitely everywhere. In those bait shops, $9 a croaker is insane. I've seen $2 to $3, and that's one of the reasons why we made some videos talking about dropper loops and dropper rigs to catch your own bait because man, that is really expensive.
Supply and demand, baby. Supply and demand.
For real.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a hard pill to swallow. I've had times offshore down in Southeast Florida where goggle eyes are like over $100 a dozen. So I mean, you do the math. That's up there, especially in sailfish season. They just get astronomically priced, $150 a dozen for like the primo wintertime bait. And a lot of it has to do, supply and demand, how difficult it is to get this bait fish and keep them alive. Because, a 6 or 8 inch croaker is somewhat difficult to get, but a goggle eye, it's got to go out at night for because you can't really get them during the day. Yeah, that'll bring you a hefty premium, I'm sure. But for inshore fishing, the good thing is that I think that the majority of the bait fish that will work well for a variety of size, even big trout, snook, redfish, mullet, pinfish, croakers, I think are big bodied bait fish. And they're going to be a high protein diet for these bigger fish. I think that's probably what they're going to key in on most. For our local waters here in the Gulf, I mean, I'd say from that Apalachicola corner all the way down through the Everglades and Flamingo. Would you agree that one of the predominant bait fish that everybody's going to want to use or fish with, and it has a bunch of different names, is a pilchard, right? Like a pilchard, or we just say white bait, to generalize all the different types of bait fish. But, pilchard, scaled sardine, even threadfin are kind of in that category too. They're actually a different species than a scaled sardine, but they can be the same size and look really, really similar. That's probably the most abundant bait forage that guys will go out and cast net tons and tons and tons of pilchards and threadfins to use live or to chum with. I'd say that's pretty common. Other than cast netting, if someone wanted to get a couple of pilchards and use them off a pier, what would be the best way to go about it? A sabiki, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Probably. Sabiki on a channel marker. That's what we did growing up. It was fun for kids.
Yeah, it's funny. We don't have many pilchards here in Texas. It seems like it's more of just a regional thing down in your neck of the woods, Justin.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the important part is, for baitfish profiles and for the different types of lures, like what we're talking about, lures that work anywhere. When we designed the Slam Shady Body and now the Gold Digger and the Fred and the Bomber, we're trying to take into consideration all of these different baitfish bodies and actions so that regardless of what specific baitfish is in your region, you have a lure that's going to best represent the baitfish that is there. So for the Bomber, for example, I think the Bomber perfectly imitates mullet. Like I really do. I think that is a perfect mullet imitation. Could even be a croaker imitation. You slow it down, work it closer to the bottom. It's a little bit bigger body, bigger tail. It's got a bigger profile. And that's really what that's trying to mimic best. And then along the lines with like Slam Shady 2.0 and Gold Digger, mud minnow. Like to me, that screams mud minnow. In those coastal marshes, I'm thinking, man, like I am overdue for some big flounder in Hallover Creek in Jacksonville. It's going to be that time of the year where the big flounders start popping up. And that either weedless, if there's a lot of oysters, or on a jig head, I think perfectly imitates a mud minnow. And that's going to be the main forage for flounder this time of the year. So again, it's region specific, right? It's the bait fish within that region, the time of the year, and the species. So let's
go into that because I think that's important because we could sit here and debate our favorites. Yeah. Let's talk about that in terms of best time of year to catch. Let's just use maybe the top 4 or 5. So best time of year and where to find them, right? Because if you just know those 2 things, you have a massive advantage. So best time of year for each of shrimp, mullet. We want to throw pinfish in there, just croakers. And then where to find them? Are they schooling? Are they sitting on a certain piece of structure?
All right, let's start at winter. Start beginning of the year, say January, guys. Wintertime for me, jumbo shrimp, big old honking monster shrimp. Like that's going to be my go-to. Again, Wyatt said in the wintertime, a lot of these bait fish we're talking about they're just not as present. They're just not out on the flats. They might be moved off the beach or just in deeper waters around passes, and they're not super common. So I'm going to be a shrimp profile all day, every day during the wintertime. If I do throw a bait fish profile, it'll be something small, like something that's going to imitate a really small pilchard or mullet, regardless of the bait species. I think winter, crustacean. That's been my go-to. What do you think, Wyatt?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you 100%. It just seems like come winter time, most of those bait fish migrations occur in the fall. So a lot of them move out. And the ones that are left are, predated on really heavily by those trout and those redfish and the flounder that are heading out as well. So their numbers are just at an all-time low throughout the year. And it just seems like fish are going to then adjust their diet to what's most prevalent. And that seems to be shrimp. That's why a lot of times you see these redfish that are in the creeks, in the marshes. That was when I had my best times for redfish because I'd get back in there. I'd find those holes where I knew that those redfish would be down in, digging around in the mud for crabs and shrimp and just, any kind of shrimp imitation, the power prawn, live target shrimp, gulp shrimp, whatever you want to use. Crustacean profiles are best in the wintertime, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say I won't throw a paddle tail around to cover some ground, but it's never going to be bigger than 3.5 inches. I do not like to use big paddle tails in the wintertime. If I'm having a hard time finding out where fish are, then I will switch to the paddle tail because shrimp and, crustacean profiles typically are a little bit slower presentation. If you're using live bait at all, you do kind of got to know where you need to go. But I would say yes, for sure. Wintertime crustacean profiles are king.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So winter was easy. We're obviously going to save fall to the end because we're about to be in fall pretty soon. It's a exciting time for big baits, and I cannot lie. So what next? What happens after winter? Spring?
I think so. I think it's spring.
There's got to be like an elementary song that we would sing to remember all the seasons, right? I'm trying to remember it in my head and I can't. Spring is, I think, the most challenging time to figure out when to use bait because it's that transition period we have kind of a transition period in fall, but when fall comes, the bait's at its biggest. So like a big profile, there's actually a lot of bait options in fall, but in spring, the bait will show up, but they're still pretty small, 2 to maybe 4 inches max. Pilchards, threadfin, little mullet, little pinfish. I think pinfish is probably my go-to in the spring. I would say that'd be my initial go-to. I've used pinfish in March and April at Sebastian Inlet, and I've got nice snook and a couple redfish. That tends to be the first bait fish that I see start showing back up as the water temperatures warm. And I found pinfish at docks, and with areas with a lot of barnacles, where there isn't seagrass too. So even though I would prefer to find pinfish and use pinfish imitations where there is a lot of seagrass, there's still in areas where there's oysters and there's barnacles and dock pilings and bridges. You'll still find pinfish as well, of different size. But in general, I think in the springtime, the bait's pretty small. So if you're going to imitate whatever forage is available, Slam Shady 2.0, that's the go-to for me in spring to imitate, pinfish, little pilchard, little threadfin, mud minnows still too. I think mud minnows are, still around. They're around year round, I think, but in spring they'll pop back up again. Just all kinds of stuff. It's hard to say best for spring, I think, because it's so transitional. There isn't like a mega bait fish where everyone's like, this is the go-to. For us in the Gulf, white bait in general, pilchard and threadfin is probably a good one. But I think pinfish would probably be more prevalent in more areas in the springtime, especially on the east coast of Florida. So I'm going to go with pinfish.
Yep. All of those videos for blackout chum, we released it kind of late spring, early summer, but, we were testing it out the whole year. But spring is when we started pushing out some of these videos, teasing that we had a new chum coming out, and we were catching loads and loads and loads of pinfish on the flats. And these were big ones, they're decent sized pinfish as well. And so a little tip, if you don't like throwing a cast net, because not everyone does, but you want to catch some pinfish, which are just absolutely awesome baits even dropping down for big grouper or snapper to big snook and redfish. You can catch some really big fish with pinfish. The one trick that we used to do is take little pieces of gulp. Maybe you have an old gulp shrimp or an old bag of gulp jerk shads, and you cut out, and Luke has a video of this, we'll make sure to put it in the show notes, but just put that on a small little gold hook, like a little sabiki hook. And we would sit there and just one after another, you get 3 people doing that on the boat, and you can fill up the live well super fast, especially if you have some chum to chum up the area. And I think that one video, do you guys remember that? Luke caught, I think it was 10 pinfish in a row, just keeps dropping it back in on one little piece of gulp on the end of this little hook. Just pop, 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 pop. It works really, really well for those of you who don't want to throw a net or don't want to. The water's still a little bit cold too, depending on what time of spring we're talking about here. And it's not always fun to throw a net. I did it with gulp in the beginning, and then as I tried fish bites as my next one, and that's what I've gone to using. I like gulp. It doesn't have a reinforced mesh inside of it. So sometimes you can go and get 10 pinfish on a little, Aberdeen gold hook. And then sometimes you just get one and they knock it off the hook because there's nothing that's reinforcing it and keeping it on there. Fish bites, as it breaks down, it gets real mushy and gummy, and it's like this goo that sticks to the hook. So which one do you like to use for that?
I like sand flea. I don't know why. I'm weird. I don't think color matters. I'll use an orange, the sand flea's kind of like a whitish orange color. But shrimp, if everything eats shrimp, a pink or like a white shrimp, like a pinkish, I think would probably stand out pretty well. It would just stick out. It's kind of like that neon color. I think shrimp's probably the most universal. For me, when I'm going for croaker, I'll use like clam and sand flea are probably my two, because most of the croaker is going to be right off the beach, which we're going to get into in summertime. That's kind of leading into my next bait. But yeah, I'd say in short, shrimp's probably the most, universal to catch a variety of bait fish, but for certain pinfish.
Cool. Do you guys ever do your own shrimping?
Ooh, I have once. I'm not a pro at it. there are certain times of the year, it is shrimp in a barrel. Like everywhere you look, they're running at night. But I'm not a hardcore shrimper. If I do, I'm going to get one to like put it back out on a hook and put it right back on for a big red. That's what I'm going to do.
Interesting. I want to stay on spring before we move on to the next season. So interesting to hear that pinfish is your choice. I would say here it's shad. And that's not necessarily going to be that you're putting shad on a hook, because these shad are, the size of a quarter, they're max 2 inches in length. It's not something you can put out on a hook. Yes, you can put small pinfish out on a hook, but shad, definitely where I'm at, are the primary forage. We get big waves of them that move through. So you'll see fish and sometimes you'll have weeks where 1 week they're on shad, 1 week they're on the shrimp that are now migrating out to the Gulf. So there's big shrimp migrations that occur. So spring, like you said, is very tough to figure out what fish are dialing in on. I would say we don't have the bait variety that you guys do here in Texas that y'all have in Florida. So it seems like shad becomes the number one bait fish that these fish, redfish and trout dial in on for sure. So that's when I'm throwing my really small 3-inch paddle tails. I'm throwing little, 1/8-ounce spoons, really tiny, shiny presentations, even little mirrodines that I can put up near those schools of shad. And you'll see it looks like raindrops on the water. They're so tiny, but you're seeing redfish. This is when you get the fattest redfish of the year because, they're filling up on shad oil, things like that, busting on shad. But it's stuff like that. That is a perfect imitation for a shad. You're going to throw that around those schools that are jumping around, and you're going to get onto a lot of fish doing that because at least here there's waves that occur of those bait fish. So that would be my choice for sure is shad.
Is that an Aqua Dream spoon?
Yeah, this one, I basically got for that reason. This is technically they call it the golden. See if that'll focus. The golden shad. Pilchard. Yeah, golden pilchard spoon. Pilchard shad. Shad, there you got American shad, you got threadfin shad that are freshwater and saltwater. The specific species, they all look so similar to our whitebait. So like the shad over where you're at could even be like, it kind of look like a small pogie, right, Wyatt? Like over in the Carolinas. But
I don't know exactly what shad I don't think they're threadfin. They're either American or they're I'm not sure. They're so tiny. I've never actually examined one, but they don't have. They're straight silver. They don't have any distinctive markings on them. So they could be tiny pogies. They could be small American. I have no idea.
Cool. That's awesome, man. All right. So that's spring. Now let's go into summer.
That's no contest. Croaker for me. East and west coast of Florida, at least. Croakers pile up on the beach on the East Coast. And a lot of guys catch croaker some people that are surf fishing will catch croaker to take home and eat. If somebody catches croaker and they don't want to keep any and they got them on their surf rig, I'll go over and ask, hey man, are you gonna use that? Because I will put it on a circle hook, flip it right back out and get a big snook or a big redfish right off the beach. Tarpon too. But croaker, I think, is the biggest one for me. There aren't as many croakers over in the Gulf of Florida, but Wyatt, I think there's definitely croakers in Texas as being, would you say, the go-to monster trout, like Mondo Gator trout bait is a big croaker, right?
100%. 100%. It's literally like once summertime rolls around, it is called croaker season. You see, guides going to the bait shops. These bait shops are sold out before the sun even comes up because all the guides are buying up croaker. They're a phenomenal bait to catch big trout with. But I've also seen them work well for snook. I've seen them work well for redfish. Medium-sized bait fish, it seems like, are the go-to in the summertime. Now, there's a distinction when we say mullet. I will say there's a distinction between your hog leg or your pony mullet that are 9, 10 inches, 12 inches long, and your finger mullet that are just a couple inches long. For me, I don't personally use croaker because the way that you catch trout with croaker most times ends up the trout goes in the box, and I like releasing them. So I would say I would prefer to use artificial, so I don't get a chance to use the croakers, but they're definitely the number one choice Finger mullet is also another big thing around here. If you can't get croakers, finger mullet work just as well. Just those, small, medium baitfish presentations, bigger than what we were talking about in spring, but we've not reached, really large baitfish profiles yet.
Cool. And then obviously we've talked about it a lot in the last couple of months. In the summer, you get this, we'll just call it white bait in general, on the flats, around bridges, even some of those channel markers as you get closer, to the beach and the inlets and passes. And great. I mean, just a great, and that's what most of the captains, here on really in the state of Florida are using, especially in the Gulf side. Most of them, have a blacked out live well in the morning, just because of what you guys said. I think they would all agree, man, I'd love to have 100 croakers. It can just get really expensive and or time consuming to catch that many, which is, why at some point I guess it was 2 years. Yeah, it was 2 years ago. They were going for $7 to $9 a pop, which is just like, ugh. So then again, would you pay $9 if you almost knew guaranteed that you're at least going to get a strike? Not you're going to catch a fish, but basically there's certain areas where if you put the right size lively croaker down, you are going to get a strike. Doesn't mean that you're going to land the fish. You might break off, you might spit it out, but you will get a strike. I'd pay $9 for that.
I would now. That's hard. It's changed over the years. Now that I've figured out how to catch them, time is a commodity and time has its own value, but I am not above, when I go fish for goggle eyes too, and other expensive bait fish, I'm never above getting on the water at 2 or 3 in the morning to catch 24 baits to use for 6-8 hours during daylight. I've done it for croakers too. I've gone out at 4 in the morning and got 18 or 24 croakers. It took me an hour and a half, 2 hours, but to me, I was okay with that amount of time, knowing that if a croaker's $9, like take my eyes, but not like, it's a balance. Once you figure out how to catch the bait, even though it's going to require a lot of effort and some, knowing areas you can go, the bait is, I think a lot of it is that it's not like there's only very specific areas to find them. It's the time in which you have to have your bait catching rig in the water to get the bite, and over time getting 12 or 15 or whatever. Some people just want the instant gratification of like, oh, bait guy got it yesterday. It's been sitting in a live well at a bait shop. All right, here's like, $50. God, that hurts to say. and here's your bait and you go fish for the day. Convenience. If I'm in an area that I'm not familiar with and I know that that's the bait that's going to work, I'll go buy it. But if I have fished that area 2, 3, 4 times, I'm going to put in some work. I'm going to research and I'm going to figure out how to catch it, keep it alive as long as it doesn't require it sloshing around in my truck, and go out to the same spot with a fresh caught bait that I know I've only handled. To me, I think that a fresh bait you catch yourself is like that quality control thing. And sometimes having a bait that hasn't been manhandled for a week or fed in a pen or whatever, I don't know, maybe it's superstition. I tend to feel like I catch more fish on that than a store-bought bait.
Interesting. Cool. All right. So summer's ending. We're going into fall. Exciting time. We got mullet run for a lot of us. What else? What's happening in fall? You guys, White already kind of touched on it. Baits are big, fun times.
Yeah. I'll say something that I'm already starting to skip. I'm starting to see trends occur. And the first thing that I would say I'm seeing now is really big menhaden. And they call them a lot of different things depending on where you live. LY Hollywood called them over in the coastal bend of Florida, over in Carabel, they're called LY. Over in the Carolinas, they're called pogies. Further north of that, Virginia, Maryland, they're bunker. Here, I believe, people just call them menhaden. I've heard them called pogies here too, but it's, they're a pretty interesting fish. They're really oily and they're really fat. So I think that if you're going after redfish specifically, dead cut menhaden is such a great way to go. If you can get live ones, obviously those work really well, but you don't even have to spend the extra money on live ones, because a dead one, it works, I've found, just as well, if not better. It's such an oily, smelly fish that those reds pick up on it really quickly. When I've been heading out to the jetty here recently, I've been using cut menhaden and cut threadfin shad, just because there's been a weird influx of threadfin shad here, really big ones, and they stay on the hook a little bit better than pogies do. But big smelly bait fish, I cannot tell you how well those work in the fall. And then, big mullet, obviously, as well. They're so prevalent. They're a go-to for everybody because they're pretty cheap. But if I had to choose, I would say a big pogie would be my bait of choice. I used them in the Carolinas for big flounder, and I've been using them here for big redfish. And I know that they work a lot of places if they're available in that region, obviously. So that would be my choice.
I know you just got back from Louisiana. Did you see those big slicks out there?
Yeah, I mean they're prevalent there as well. You go across, you'll see sharks and bull redfish blowing up on men, and you can literally smell the oil coming off of these fish. It smells like watermelon. And you've probably been out on the water and smelled it, and you don't even realize it. You think maybe someone brought a nice snack on your boat or something, but you smell these slicks, and that's all menhaden, and the fish pick up on that underwater 10 times over you above the surface. So I cannot say enough that menhaden is such a great bait in the fall. So that is I know I've kind of cheated a little bit and said one or two baits for the last couple of seasons, but I'll say in the fall, menhaden just cannot be beat.
Yeah. And when we were in Louisiana, this would have been October, so fall. And that's all we did. We had no spots. Like, we literally had nothing in terms of a GPS spot. And we just went out there in the bay, and we had binoculars, and we looked for the menhaden oil slicks. And as long as it's not too rough, I mean, you can see them. Like, it looks like an oil. It looks like someone spilt oil, like a tanker. And you just go there, and then you shut the motor off, and you make a cast with a popping cork and slam shady, and all of a sudden you're hooked up to big redfish or sharks or even monster catfish. Really, really wild. It was just like a dead giveaway of where the predator fish were going to be.
Yeah. The one caveat to this, I will say, menhaden are not necessarily the best bait for trout, just because they're so wide. I don't think that trout would want to hit a bait like that. At least most of the ones that we're after, they probably can't fit them in their mouths. I don't know about snook. I don't think menhaden's probably a popular bait in snook zones. But most of the fish that I'm targeting in the fall, the species that I'm after, which is another big thing, whatever species you're after, you should kind of know what their primary forage is that time of year. It's mainly redfish that I'm talking about here. Yeah. Flounder will go after pogies as well, pretty well. But redfish, flounder, not necessarily trout or snook. So Justin, maybe you can touch on some fall baits for snook and kind of fill in that gap there.
I think it goes back to regional, like I don't see, I wanted to just say, as funny as it sounds, in Tampa, like right out the central West Coast, some guys call pogies shad. When you're chunking for tarpon, some guys call we call it turbos, like the monster, 10 plus inch pogies. Guys have called them shad and chunking for tarpon off the beach, off Egmont. So it's funny, like the names of what things are called in different areas. We call them shad in that section of Florida. And, for regionally, like fishing for snook and trout, I don't normally find pogies or menhaden south of like Sebastian Inlet, central east coast of Florida. From about there north, I'll find them of all different sizes. And the further north I get, the more common that baitfish is. And then on the Gulf side too, I found them at Cedar Key. I found them off the Panhandle, and I would say it's a summer and the majority being fall baitfish until we get some cold fronts and some hurricanes and things mix things up and the bait disappears. I would agree. That's the go-to bait. And it will definitely work on snook if we had it down south of about central Florida. If pogies were there, I would even argue to say that a pogie might beat out a croaker, honestly, if they were present.
But we have mullet, right? And so, yeah, at least in a lot of Florida, you got the mullet run. And that's a cool time to catch big tarpon and big snook using mullet. And I remember the one time we went right off the beach and just basically foul hooking these mullet, throwing them on a circle hook and throwing them right back out. I mean, it's chaotic. Something that everyone must experience if you haven't done it.
It's like a world wonder, really. Like when you see it and you get on it and you can say, I mean, that's a story to tell your kids. Like I would say that, like I was there for the mullet run of August 2011 in Nassau Sound in Jacksonville. It was like someone had a shotgun start And I'm watching tarpon mill around and blow up on these monstrous mullet. But then one day, I think I came out before a big storm front was coming through, and it was, again, herds, stampede of mullet, just go, 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 go. And it was like out of the blue. It was incredible to watch. It was like fish were just backflipping over top of each other, and very, very cool experience. Makes you want to, be fine-tuned to the weather and get in on the action while you can.
Yep, that is awesome. So what else for the fall?
I would say another bait to touch on for the fall, at least when I was in the Carolinas, and I know we were talking about bait fish mainly, but in the fall in the Carolinas, if you went up to the Outer Banks and you threw out some blue crabs, you were going to catch a monster old drum. They call them up there. And those are your 40s and 50s, your really big redfish. You put blue crab in the surf, you're going to get a big bait. Pretty much you're going to get a big redfish guaranteed. And I know a lot of people do the same thing here in Texas on the jetties. You put out some of those blue crabs. I'm seeing a lot of them up near the shoreline. I literally caught one. I dangled a little mullet in front of one so I could put it out in the surf. They're starting to show up more, and I know that the big redfish are on them as well. And that's, we talked about, you get a lot of big redfish in the spring because they're eating shad. Well, big redfish also come from crabs as well. So you want to get a big redfish in the fall in the surf. I'd say put out some blue crab. You will not be disappointed. It's a little bit of an extra out there. I wouldn't say it's the best bait to use, but it's a very tactic specific bait.
Love it. We'll have to do I'm looking at the time. We'll have to do a completely separate one just on the rigging. Or if you're really wise, you will just go invest in Captain Peter Deek's live bait mastery and underwater bait forensics. I mean, those two combined, oh my gosh. So the underwater bait forensics is how to rig every one of these live baits that we've talked about, and then some, based on the scenario, current, no current, different types of structure. If you're free lining it, or if it's under a cork or a weight, amazing. And then the other one is where to find all of the different types of baits and rigging it and fishing it, the entire presentation. That's a big part of it, right? I think so many people, you hear live bait and you kind of think like lazy man's fishing, right? You get the live bait and you throw it out there and put it in a rod holder and you have your bush light, which is all great and fine and dandy. We've all done that, or at least I have many times. And it's not like when Captain Peter Deeks, like he doesn't want any rod holders except maybe put a rod in there while he's, bringing netting a fish. But I mean, no rod holders. It's active live bait management, where many times he's got the spool open and he's feeling every little small strike with his fingers. I mean, it's intense. It's kind of like you're fishing with a lure, but you have a live bait doing the work for you. It's really, really fascinating. Everyone, even some captains who have been through that course, were like, holy smokes, no wonder Captain Peter Deeks is doing the stuff he's doing. No wonder Bill Dance has hired him as kind of his go-to guy for catching monster fish, on camera for a TV show. It's really, really fascinating. So you can see all of that. It's saltstrong.com. In the product section, we have all of our mastery courses. I believe it's like 28 now, 28 or 29 mastery courses. And that was one of my favorites. We don't do as much live bait fishing, but when it counts, like when you want to go catch a potential state record or a PB record, more likely, live bait's tough to argue with. I think for overall consistency and just getting strikes, I'm going to go lures, and it's just, easier, not as messy, quicker. But doggone, it's tough to argue if you've ever done it or been out with a guide like a Peter Deeks and you see the size of fish they're catching and the live bait, it's really tough to argue with. What else, guys? What do we leave off? Minus the obvious stuff. I mean, we could have talked about this for hours.
I mean, I'm thinking right now, my next upcoming trip, in the fall months, Wyatt, you and we all know big redfish are going to start schooling up. And when they're schooled up, it's the big bulls, and it could be a school of 50 or 100 plus fish on the flats or right off the beach. I mean, it's very visual. You can see them and get up on them. And even though big, going for big redfish, you want to use bait. In the situation where I'm targeting a school that I can actively see, I won't use bait, at least not for redfish. So we have a weird time of the year where these big redfish are at schooling. You can see them, you can get up close to them, and the school's moving pretty fast. You need to have a lure. I like to use lures. I'll just go right onto it. A big topwater or a Slam Shady bomber are probably going to be my go-to lures for big redfish here over the next 2 months. We're going to have this window of opportunity. If you know that they're in the area and you can pick them apart, the only problem with bait is that, when it lands, it's going to make a cannonball sound. And when you're trying to get up on these schools of fish that are milling around or, moving at a straight path, you can completely deter and just wig out these fish by throwing a mullet through the air or a croaker or chunk of crab. It might work if they don't hear it splash, but oftentimes it's going to, and it's going to, the hamburgers don't fall from the sky, right? So, in that situation here in the summertime, in fall, this is what I'm going to go to. I'm going to have, a moonwalker or a big skitter walk, and I'm going to have a bomber on a heavier, like a 3/16 ounce or even a 5/0 quarter ounce, so that I can just absolutely launch it in front of that school and present. That's the time of the year where you can go out and get a really, really big fish on artificial. So even if you don't have bait, at least here for this time of the year, you can still get a big one, and particularly redfish on artificial, because you can cast multiple times, present multiple times. You don't have to re-rig or worry about, knocking out your bait mid-cast. So definitely don't discredit. These would be the two that I would have, as the live bait alternatives, to make sure that I've got casting distance, I've got good presentation that mimics what they're feeding on. And sometimes, I don't have to worry about getting squirrely when it lands in the water. It's going to have all the action. I'm going to be working it the whole time and getting them hyped up. So that's my little tip I'm going to leave you guys with if you target any schools of redfish here this time of the year.
Yeah. I would have to agree. It's interesting that we're doing this live bait podcast as two anglers, and Joe, 3 anglers really, that, we know a lot about live bait because it factors into how we present our artificial lures and which artificial lures we use. Even if you're not a live bait angler, or if you are and you want to start catching more fish, I'd say definitely consider those, artificial lures. And it's funny, the ones that Justin just held up are the 2 that I used yesterday when tournament fishing. I caught a bunch of overslot redfish. You can see the moonwalker hanging out of that one's mouth. But, as soon as the sun came up past my hand, like we talked about, I started using the bomber. So and that's because we're starting to get into that larger bait. We talked about how it changes seasonally, and your lures should change seasonally as well with what's in, what those fish are dialed in on. So I hope you guys remember all the stuff we've talked about today in terms of what happens to be the primary forage for that time of year. And that is really what's going to factor into what you can use what you use as far as lures go. And you'll see a lot more success by trying to match that bait with the lures that you're using. Like I said, we're getting into larger bait fish. So those big bombers, those top waters, the moonwalker, those are all really great choices for the season we're about to get into. But always try to keep live bait in mind, what's going on, so that you can choose the right lures as well.
Yep. Super helpful. And guys, all of the lures and even live bait hooks, but everything we talked about today is over at fishstrong.com. Go pick up yours. Of course, if you're an insider member, 20% off everything there in the store. Got some new things coming here for the fall and winter. Everything's just doggone still taking so long. I know we're all sick and tired of hearing the COVID excuse, but it's still here. And it's not just, people getting sick. It's just supply chain issues, and everything has just been taking so long. It is absolutely brutal, but there's, it's getting somewhat better. It's not as bad as it was at its worst. And we are getting stuff in every week. We got deliveries coming in. So keep staying on fishstrong.com. And of course, we have notifications set up for all of the products where it'll automatically notify you. And I would go text if you want to be as quick, as we've had some people, oh yeah, I'm on there, I should be fine. Some of these things go in an hour, or less. So I would get on text and let us text you as soon as that product comes in, and then boom, it'll have a link and you can go right there and buy yours and claim yours. So appreciate all of you so much. You mean the world to us, especially you insiders. If you're not a member, come join us. It's over at saltstrong.com. It is the only club guaranteed to help you catch more fish and save money on all of your tackle. So come join us and the other 25,000 members at saltstrong.com. Wyatt and Justin, thank you guys. This was a fun one. And I'm sure we'll have many more conversations. If we missed something, which I know we did, and this, we could have probably taken 15 different tangents into 30-minute conversations. There's so much to talk about with live bait. Leave us a comment. If you have questions on certain things you'd like to see, leave us a comment. And that's all at saltstrong.com. In the fishing tips section, you'll see this podcast along with links to anything that we mentioned, like pulling up tons of pinfish with gulp. We'll have to do one with fish bites too. It seems like it could be its own little tip. Jot that one down on your little pad of paper there, Bob. All right, guys, we out of here. Peace.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was